We're live. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today for this Accessibility Talks discussion panel on the subject Accessibility is Too Hard. Our plan is to dig a little bit into sort of misconceptions about the difficulties of accessibility that developers might have, but also to examine some of the ways in which accessibility is genuinely difficult and maybe we aren't as honest or as forthcoming about that as we should be. So I'm going to start today with introductions. So we'll kick it off with Marcy. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Marcy Sutton. I'm the head of learning at Gatsby, a startup focused on a website framework for building fast, accessible websites. Previously, I was a developer advocate at DQ Systems, where I worked on Axe Core and accessibility tooling. Sort of going further back than that, I started my career as a web developer. I didn't know anything about accessibility. I was actually tasked with not only incorporating accessibility into my work in agency life, but also training people about accessibility. And so I really found that I cared about it, and I've heard lots of enthusiasm, lots of challenges. So I'm excited to talk more today about, what are those common things that we hear and how do we respond and actually make progress with accessibility.
Great. All right, Kathleen, on to you. You're muted, Kathleen.
I was bringing my cursor over there. Hi, so I'm Kathleen McMahon, and I am currently the tech lead for the O'Reilly Media Design System. And previously, before that, I have been a front-end engineer at MIT, where both here and there I was, along with doing engineering, I was also leading up the accessibility initiative for our teams. But how I got into accessibility, which is kind of a fun fact, because for years I was a designer and more of that design developer. And I happened to follow a friend of mine, Marcy Sutton, and she started talking a lot about accessibility. And when I was listening to all the things she was sharing, I'm like, wow, this is a really important problem to solve. I have a bit of a, I don't know if you call it a gene for, if something's not right, like focus on making it right. And this was a big thing. I'm like, oh my God, I can put my passion right into this. And it's a really interesting problem to solve, and it's a right problem to solve. So this is how I got into it. And I'm very excited to be among a very talented bunch of individuals here to talk about the challenges we face and how we can make things better.
Awesome. Aisha, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Aisha Blake. I am a brand new software engineer at Gatsby. This is week 2. Previously, I worked at a company called Detroit Labs, where I helped to start a web, or rather an accessibility work group where we were developing process of training and making sure that people were aware of existing standards, as well as making sure that we were consistent in building our applications accessibly. How I got into accessibility, though, I was actually a volunteer for the New York goalball team. So for anybody who doesn't know, goalball is a sport for blind and visually impaired athletes. And at one point while I was in college, the New York team asked me to build a website for them. And I realized that I didn't know what a blind person would, how a blind person would go about using the internet. And so that kind of got me down a rabbit hole. Started watching a whole lot of Marcy Sutton videos, and I've just been really passionate about making sure that people understand how to make their apps and their sites accessible since. So I'm really excited to be here along with some real experts to talk about how we can make it a little easier.
Great. Scott, tell us about yourself.
I'll try to keep that limited. So, hey, I'm Scott O'Hara. I'm a senior accessibility engineer over at the Paciala Group. I do a bunch of contributions to various accessibility focused specs over at the W3C. Not limited to, but including the ARIA specification. I got into accessibility. Like in that I kind of always was into accessibility, but I didn't really understand that I was up until, maybe the early 2010s, or however you're supposed to announce that, 2013, early teens. In that I, had always been really interested in UX and the semantics of HTML. And I was fortunate enough to see a talk by Mark Sadecki, where he really went into the importance of HTML and its semantics and how that, allows people, disabilities using screen readers to interact with the web. And it really just clicked it with me, because it was like, oh, here's this thing that I really love and it can actually help people. That's cool. I want to focus on that. Because that's just kind of what's important to me. So
Great. Yeah, and Jared.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm Jared Smith. I'm the Associate Director of WebAIM. WebAIM is the Web Accessibility in Mind project. We're based at the Center for Persons with Disabilities at Utah State University. And WebAIM is just going into our 20th year that we've been doing web accessibility. My background was in design development. I was doing web stuff. I had a teaching degree and loved to teach and train, and found myself at WebAIM, and I've been with WebAIM about 18 years now, so a long time. They haven't been able to get rid of me, so it's worked out pretty well. WebAIM provides technical assistance and consultation to empower organizations to build and maintain their accessibility. So we've worked with many hundreds of organizations, from small nonprofits to Fortune 100 corporations, some that are well along the path of accessibility, some that are just starting. So we've had quite a bit of experience. Personally, I've in-person trained probably well over 10,000 developers, designers, folks about accessibility. And even with that experience, the question for this panel of is accessibility too hard caused me a lot of contemplation, a lot of thought about the current state of the web and what we can do to maybe make it better. And I'm excited to have the discussion today.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited about the range of expertise we have here. And I'm Caitlin Cashin. I worked for 8 years at DQ Systems, which is an accessibility vendor in marketing, and spent a lot of time marketing specifically to developers and kind of figuring out what's the best way to communicate this information and help them understand it. So this is a question I continue even after I've left DQ to think about late into the night. So I'm excited to get started. So to kick things off, let's talk about, what are reasons that we have heard from developers and dev teams about why accessibility is too hard or we can't prioritize it right now. And, how do you usually respond to those reasons that they offer? Let's kick things off. How about you, Jared? I'm curious, after so many years, you must have heard everything.
Sure. I've probably heard most of it. Often what I say is the foundational reason for inaccessibility is ableism. It is, I think, a foundational reason, and much of that is not intentional. I think most of the people that are building things for the web want to have a good experience, but much of that comes from lack of understanding of the experience of individuals with disabilities, understanding of the impact that many of the people, developers that are building for the web don't have much experience, those authentic interactions and experiences with individuals with disabilities. And so when I hear that it's too hard, I think it's maybe it isn't, maybe it's too hard because they haven't made it a priority. I think as we've worked with organizations and they see that vision of accessibility and they build a culture of inclusion and they have dialogues with people with disability, with their customers, when they include people with disabilities in their practices, in their employment, then there really becomes no viable alternative to providing that type of equitable experience. And that's when it, I think, becomes easier. I don't know that question of is accessibility hard? Is it easy? I don't know. I'll probably answer that a little bit more over time. But I think that's a lot of the catalyst for the reasons, for the excuses for inaccessibility is a lot of people, I think, don't understand how impactful it is. And when they understand that, then they make efforts to understand it, and then it becomes easier.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Like, yeah, at the center of things, yeah, it has to be ableism ultimately. And I mean, I don't know, like, but what do you do about that? Like, how do you, because we can't go to, the dev team and be like, well, this is a very ableist, view that you're looking at things through. Or, I mean, maybe you can. Does anybody have experience or success with that? Or, yeah, how do you get through that barrier?
I would add one thing is just that we need to be careful that it does not become the burden of individuals with disabilities to do that. Organizations need to take that upon themselves. And again, I think as they build a culture and have commitment and resources to accessibility, a lot of that tends to come natural. You're right. We don't want to approach people and say, you're ableist, but that I think is a root cause. And it's understanding maybe how they got there and what they can do about it that helps resolve those issues.
Yeah, some of the most impactful things I've seen that have really opened people's minds to the need for accessibility is seeing someone with a disability try to use the internet or use a project, especially if it's like you see somebody try and fail to use something that you've designed and developed. That can be very enlightening for somebody who's just like, it's not our problem, it's not, I don't care about it, it's not our audience. So having that awareness of, I'm excluding people, like that's where I've seen light bulbs go on. And there's some tension there with, as a pretty able-bodied public speaker going in and trying to make the case for this, I want to take on some of that burden of getting that message out there. At the same time, like I'm able-bodied, so how authentic can I be to that experience? So really trying to, I don't know, bring people in as stakeholders, like on teams. I think that can be really powerful to actually have that input from people with disabilities on your projects. And so, I don't know, my mind's turning a lot more now towards user testing with people with disabilities, like getting people in the room, paying them for their time to help you work through challenges. And there's groups that can help you do that, like Nobility's Access Works group. I've worked with a group called Fable in Toronto, and there might be something local to your area. That could be a really great way to have somebody with a disability consult with you on a design problem, a development problem, and do it early and often so that you can have it affect change in the process. Because we need to do it at the end of everything. It's like throwing it out over the fence once you're done is way too late. We hear shift left, get it earlier in the process. And that's because once it's baked in, that phrase from Cordelia Dillon comes to mind of if you're making I think it was a blueberry muffin, you can't shove the blueberries in afterward. Like it's structural, it's cultural, it needs to be done earlier. So like Jared said, making it part of your culture and then bringing in consultants, hiring team members with disabilities, like make it truly part of your culture. I think that's a big part of the solution Educating people, of course, like there's that gap in knowledge of like, oh, we didn't know. It's like, okay, well then what do you do about it now? And so I think user testing, working with people with disabilities, that's truly how I think we can make a big change.
Yeah, I mean, did anyone want to speak to one of the topics directly? Kathleen, you've got.
Yeah, I totally agree with Marcy here, especially about the user testing. At O'Reilly, when I started, the director of product was very interested in, improving the accessibility and the whole experience of the site. And what we did was I started off some workshops, some just intro workshops on empathy building and, targeted for just general accessibility, like issues out there, demonstrating some of the tools, demonstrating things like no coffee, like blurring the screen, and just, demonstrating like how our site looks. If like, for example, if you had some sort of vision impairment or other things like that. And what was interesting is you would hear your coworkers start saying, wow, I didn't realize this. And you'd see people in a Zoom chat start going, wow, oh my God, I had no idea this happened. Or, oh, these tools are so cool. Thanks for showing this to me. And what was great about it is you would see more people start thinking about it in their workflow. But also you would, over time, you would start seeing more developers asking questions, or other people saying, thank you for saying this. I haven't told anyone, but I have, I can't hear in this ear, or I didn't realize I couldn't see all colors until you showed me these tools. And then I realized that I have something going on here. So you brought up this awareness for developers to start thinking more about this, and designers to start thinking more about this. And it's a good first step, but I think what Marcy says is even more powerful of you need to include those users with disabilities in the process, because you can build empathy and make change and make impact in a more powerful way versus me saying, hey, look at these tools and do this. If you see someone actually using your site and seeing how they're having trouble, you will prioritize this more in your workflow.
Yeah, totally. Does anybody else want to jump in? Yeah, Scott.
So yeah, as Kathleen mentioned, or one of her coworkers or someone that was listening to her basically responding with, "Oh, I didn't know." That basically, to me, kind of sums up everything that we've been talking about so far. Is that one of the reasons that accessibility is so hard to people is because they really don't necessarily know about it. One, because they have not, actually worked with people with disabilities or interacted with people with disabilities, and thus you can't know about what you haven't exposed yourself to. These are wonderful people. Go out, make some friends. You'll learn something. But also, like, anything's hard if you don't know about it. Like we have some really talented JavaScript developers on the panel here today, and JavaScript's hard for me. I make my way through it, but it's hard. But that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile and that people shouldn't learn it. Design and performance and UX and security, those are all hard. But I don't ever see anyone be like, oh, well, we can just do design at the end, figure it out later. So I think it all just kind of comes down to context and what people are familiar with, what they're exposed to, what they know. Because if you know about something, like, you might still think it's complicated. Accessibility is very complicated, it's complex. But is it hard? Everything's hard.
One thing I wanted to add too is that I feel like we talk a lot about the responsibility of designers and developers when we're talking about accessibility, but in my experience, at least, it's also really important to bring in QA and to make sure that they are knowledgeable and informed and buying into this process. And that way, as you are building a thing, you have somebody there who's checking all of these other points that are necessary to get to your definition of done. And so including accessibility in that definition is really important.
Yeah, sort of, I definitely agree. And I would add product owners, like, product managers, people who are speccing out how much work you might do in a certain amount of time. Like, yeah, it's really cultural and goes beyond just design and development. I mean, if you're just trying to solve it in development, you might not be set up for success. Certainly if it's not thought of at all in a design. The sort of anecdote that comes to mind was working with a team that said, I was like, well, why aren't there focus states? There's no thought of this at all in your style guide. And they said, oh, that doesn't belong in there. And it's like, as a developer, that's like a way bigger conversation than just working on focus states. So it's usually like layers of an onion that you just keep peeling back and like getting deeper and deeper to the root causes. And so, whoever is defining those definition of done, if that's owned by a product person, we need to get them on board too. And I think that's a key to making it really successful and making something innovative and accessible, because I think we all know it's possible. We just don't see it happen that often. So how do we make that happen? That's what I want to know.
Well, and I mean, and there is, of course, kind of going down a different path, like the regulatory perspective. I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently where, oh no, I can't remember her name, but, they were speaking to a major figure in disability rights in like the 60s and 70s. And, she grew up in the 50s going to school, and there were no accessibility laws or anything. There were laws that actually said, well, if, I don't know, a business feels like you're too upsetting to look at or to be around, then they could exclude you from, from their business or their location. And, and it took legal action and like making laws about it for people to actually do something about it. Like, I think, a lot of times we like to sort of think like, oh, well, like we'll do the right thing. Of course, like you don't need to set laws to make people just, show each other basic humanity, but it turns out like maybe you do. And, that in fact, that's like the way pretty much all human rights have made progress in the past is through some kind of regulatory action. But developers can't do a lot about that. So I don't know. I mean, I know I tend to think like, of course, we talk a lot about like, well, you need to be thinking about accessibility from the beginning. We need to be teaching accessibility. Like, it needs to be part of every training program, every college program. And I kind of have found myself sort of being like, yes, and once you do that, like people can just make things and they will be accessible and we won't have to worry about it anymore. But I think even if we got to that utopian state, in practice, like every accessibility issue is different, or it's a weird combination of like, well, they're using JAWS 6 and Explorer, and this they don't know how to use this keyboard shortcut or something, and it's not like there is just sort of a universal way to code things and make them accessible, and and I think, I don't know, I mean, maybe you all like are really great at communicating that, but I know that's sort of something that I hadn't really thought about, the fact that like you still have to be able to do testing, you still have to know how to use a screen reader, you're going to have to do some kind of accessibility testing, even if you're an amazing developer who knows how to do all of this from the get-go. I mean, how do you get developers on board with that idea? Or dev teams?
It's a good question. We do spend an awful lot of time in accessibility on those fringes, on those really technical things, the ARIA, and that's really not where most of the accessibility barriers are occurring. And we have pretty good data, and WebAIM checked 1 million homepages, and the vast majority of those issues are foundational accessibility things that we've been talking about for 20 years. Alternative text and form labels and text in buttons and identifying the document language. And, so those things difficult to do? No, not really. Maybe they require some difficult questions about things like color contrast, but they're not that difficult to implement. And starting there, I think is going to be useful. Certainly, it's going to be very impactful on people with disabilities to address some of those foundational issues broadly, and then that's focus a little more on the fringes. A lot of it, I think, is just making accessibility part of the craft of design and development and the user experience. As I thought about that question, is it hard to learn HTML and CSS? No. Is it hard to learn JavaScript? No. But is it hard to become a master of that craft? It is. And can you be a master of design, development, and coding without accessibility? I would say no. And I think most developers, designers, UX people out there, they want to differentiate themselves. They want to become a master of their craft. And I think helping them understand that accessibility is a component and a differentiator for them in their field could help maybe motivate some of this change.
Yeah, I would add to that, again, back on the overall topic of why this might be hard to some people, is that I think that they miss out on some of those very fundamental things like Jared was saying, and they sometimes even overcomplicate things. They add ARIA when they don't need ARIA. They try to make overly complex user interactions when a more straightforward interaction, which would probably help everyone, would make for better user experiences. But they look at it as developers, designers, PMs, whoever, if everyone doesn't really kind of understand what the fundamental issue is that they're trying to solve, which is good user experience for everyone, they're each going to come at it from the vantage point of what makes sense to them and what's important to them at that point in time. And they're going to attack it in the way that they know how to do it. And again, getting back into developers and overcomplicating things, that may be why there is so much ARIA in websites that don't necessarily perform well for accessibility conformance, because they look at it and be like, well, this is a problem I can solve with code because I solve problems with code. Where again, if you go back down the chain of command and you're like, well, all right, well, can we make this design simpler so everyone can understand it? Can we make sure that it's a priority for the project managers or the main stakeholders, and be like, well, what do we need to actually get this done without making it overcomplicated? And then you get simpler solutions for simpler problems.
Yeah, I feel like some of the difficulty is like when you get to that point where you're like, oh, if this was just simpler, we wouldn't be spending as much time or money worrying about it. That is hard to be sometimes, is when you're working with certain personalities who just feel very strongly, and I've seen this throughout my career, where they're very hesitant to want to change it for whatever reason. They're just so bought into whatever solution they've come up with, and it's like their baby, and trying to change it like that, to me, is the harder part than whatever technical thing you're trying to figure out, is the like human aspect. Like Jared said, it really comes down to ableism, and that's pervasive. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to work around, is getting people on board, helping them understand that like you're saving them time and money too. We have to kind of remove the ego out of it and the it's my baby way of thinking. And I've come across that a lot. And that's when you end up having to go to battle, and it's like, dramatic and uncomfortable, where sometimes if people were just more open to simpler solutions, I can think of quite a few concrete examples of that, where simpler would just be better for everyone involved. But like, that's the part that we have to work around, is people clenching too tightly onto some solution that they think is the right way to go.
Yeah, well, and it seems like, managing expectations is kind of a big part of it. Like if you have the expectation that accessibility is an issue, then, at least you shouldn't be surprised when, you're ready to like hit, go live, and somebody says, well, hang on, this is not accessible. And I mean, even, as somebody who like really cares about accessibility, like, I've been through things where like one of my coworkers was sort of sharing like, you know, they made this pattern library and it's accessible and it's amazing. And, you know, wow, look at all this stuff. And then kind of at the end, you know, one of our accessibility experts is like, actually, like the animation here is kind of a problem. And it was just like, oh, like, you know, and even though she's totally right, you do have that like wet blanket moment. And, you know, and I think it's hard to just sort of learn to be okay with that, or, you know, to care as much about it. And yeah, I mean, I feel like that's where a lot of, certainly, you know, for a lot of organizations, the first time they're hearing about accessibility is kind of like when they're ready to hit go on something. And then it's like, oh no, wait, like you're gonna have to take another 4 weeks to go fix these things and maybe rework the design. And I mean, is there anything that can be done about that? Is that, you know, like, how do you make that a more pleasant experience for the teams that have to deal with that? Yeah.
I can speak a little bit about that. That's one thing. We are doing that in our design systems. We are trying to make more like small components that are using semantic HTML under the hood and following those accessibility best practices. Now, that said, of course, it's up to the developers to implement those correctly. So you make sure you're having those best practices, also having patterns to say correct usage, maybe incorrect usage. But I think also one of the bigger problems that, I mean, you could have an accessible design system, but there's also the conundrum of like, okay, we're checking off these WCAG success criteria boxes, but honestly, a lot of the success criteria is the bare minimum that you should be, you know, achieving to make an inclusive experience. And so it's pretty often you'll sometimes get into debates of like, oh yes, okay, you have all your, you know, hover, focus, and active states, but you know, that's a very subtle UX, you know, like the difference between states are like very, very subtle. Like the color shifts would be like technically accessible, but like for example, if you have a focus state and like debates on like, why should we have an active state? You know, show me that success criteria of why we should make, you know, give this, you know, this indicator to the user. I don't see a success criteria for that. There is this different level of also including our users, which goes back to the user testing need of go to those users to say, okay, this is, you know, like I can't use this because I don't understand how this control is interactive or not. Because there's no obvious color change, or like my connection is slow, so I don't see like certain things happening in a correct sequence that is obvious to me. Those type of interactions aren't really solved by checking a box, and it's a bigger conversation that you could like build something into your components, but if you aren't testing with users, you know, are you really solving it? And is your team really learning from that?
Yeah. Yeah, Aisha, I'm kind of curious to hear more about, like, because you kind of had to internally like get a team to start doing accessibility. Like, how did that go? How did it work?
Yeah, so I was approached by a handful of our QA team, and the ask was basically, we know that this is a thing that we need to be better at, and we know that, you know, you've taught and all of that. So it was initially getting like a core group of people who even knew what the standards were. So getting them to a place where like, okay, they're pretty familiar with WCAG. We also are doing native mobile apps. So understanding, we kind of were basing off of the BBC guidelines. And so getting that core group together who could serve as a sort of a jumping off point. So now you have this core group of people who are spread across project teams who are able to be a point person for each of their teams. And so spreading that knowledge throughout the organization, and also getting buy-in. And so at that point, then we were able to say, okay, well, we want to kind of make this bigger push to make sure that all of the apps that we build are being built with accessibility in mind from the beginning. How do we go about doing that? So it's a combination of training, like making sure that people understand what the guidelines are, as well as sort of getting them hands-on experience. So asking developers to come and sit down, do a lunch and learn, and use a screen reader, use switch controls to navigate, and kind of introducing them to potential users who have various disabilities. There's a whole range, and we did get some pushback from some people for a number of reasons. Some pushback, some questions. You know, how much longer is this going to take? So, like, what are we going to need to build into our estimates? How is this going to affect our deadlines? But I think overall, once people understood that they were doing a lot of things already that kind of brought them closer to meeting those success criteria, it was a little bit easier to then get them to commit to doing more and making sure that we were kind of covering as many bases as we could.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in that case, was the QA team responsible for doing a lot of the testing after the code was written, or was the dev team responsible for some of that?
So it was definitely spread across the team. The QA team across the company is really taking on a lot of the initiative. But then that kind of spread to, and now developers are going to need to know, okay, how do we meet these standards? And so that became more common. We kind of had regular meetings where people are coming in, asking questions, and slowly, you know, getting people more familiar. And so there's more of a shared responsibility. And excuse me, designers as well went through their own round of training, and kind of that's and then as a team, we're kind of conferring with each other, making sure that everybody kind of understood where they could step in and make sure that the designs in the first place were kind of guiding us towards accessible apps.
Did anybody else want to jump in on that? Because if not, I want to shift gears a little bit. But no? Okay. You know, I know we've talked a little bit about ARIA, and that, I don't know, it fascinates me how much of a problem ARIA is. Like, you know, one of my favorite examples is a developer I know was looking at code, and this table was broken and somebody had incorrectly used some ARIA something, and they put in a little comment like, this is here for accessibility, you know, for blind people or whatever. And, you know, and so like they tried, like they thought they were doing the right thing, and it totally broke stuff. And, you know, and I think a lot of developers think like, oh, okay, well, ARIA label, I just put this on everything that needs a label. And I mean, Jared, your WebAIM study with the 1 million pages, I think showed that sites that used ARIA were less likely to be accessible or less accessible than sites that don't use it at all. Like what's going on there? Like how is that fixable, or what's up with that?
Maybe start. I think it's hard to, I don't know, it's two parts there. One of it's one part is certainly the awareness that we've been talking about and understanding, and certainly testing practices and user testing. We, on the other hand, we can't just blame ARIA. It's not the specification's fault. But that said, I think there can be improvements there, and better models, better tools for testing. That is something else we found, really with the million-page study that we did, is that there are strong correspondences between uses of tools and frameworks and accessibility issues. And that maybe improving some of that tooling would and could have a very significant impact. And right now, I think we see a lot of these frameworks that are introducing ARIA that is also introducing accessibility issues. So I don't know, it's a complicated issue, but I think it's that awareness and then transferring that awareness back to the specifications and having good models and tools that and make this really wide scale. I'm more and more convinced that we have to help one developer at a time, but every developer is using tools. They're using frameworks. They're hopefully using testing platforms, and making those better is going to be really impactful.
Yeah, and Scott, you gave a whole presentation on some of the things that are genuinely difficult for developers.
Yeah, ARIA, misuse of ARIA is a symptom of an issue. ARIA is not the problem. It's, again, not using a tool that is meant to help correctly. I can eat cereal with a shovel. That's going to hurt my teeth, but I can do it. It's dumb, but I can do it. So I think it's, like Jared was saying, people are using ARIA to try to solve problems when maybe they shouldn't be using ARIA. People are using frameworks to try to build websites when maybe they shouldn't be using frameworks. It's all comes down to, do people really know what they're doing? And if they do know what they're doing, then they can use those tools correctly and build really great things. But these things can also help people that don't know what they're doing build things very quickly that can be very problematic. And again, it's not specific to just development and ARIA or JavaScript, or, you can look throughout life and see anytime you take a slapdash effort to do something, it's going to come out as slapdash. So it comes down to, do people really know what they're doing? Do they take stock in the work that they do, or are they just trying to get something done? And as long as it looks done, is that good enough for them? I would submit that it's not. And I think that people can take a little bit more pride sometimes in what they're doing, and then we'll just get better work out of everyone. And maybe that sounds like the grumpy old man talking, but what
I think too that you're getting at, maybe another reason that people don't even try is that they know that they don't know, and there's some fear there.
Yeah, I think that's true. So it was actually, it's completely discounting the fact that people using switches or voice recognition or screen readers versus just standard keyboard controls, and how it's actually okay for all of those things to be different, and that users will use something the way that works best for them, and as long as their expectations are met, then it's actually okay. And it's really hard to quantify that when you need to test. Does it check?
Aisha, you bring up a great point, though, that many don't approach accessibility because they do see it as difficult, as hard. And we've talked about the complexities of this problem, and it's a big question, but it's a challenge I think that we face in the field of accessibility, is how do we make accessibility more approachable so people want to give it a try, that they feel like they can start to do something without having to do everything. It's an interesting question, because it's difficult, but we have to be careful about presenting it as overly complex and difficult, or they won't try.
Yeah, so much of this conversation speaks to why I do the work I do at Gatsby and stuff, having worked on a lot of this at DQ on accessibility tools. when I got into accessibility, there was a lot of camaraderie around people who had been in the industry for a while. And now I understand that they had been kind of like beat down and were like, we're in the trenches and, we're going to make the most of it. But from the outside looking in, it was very like wagging your finger at like, well, there was like this attitude about accessibility that didn't really appeal to me. And so I went into it being like, well, let's have a more positive approach to it to try and bring people along. I think that was successful in some ways, naive in other ways. I've definitely evolved my thinking on that since then. But also since then, the tools have gotten a lot better. So I remember very clearly working on some project for Target and working with a blind QA person at Target. And he's like, you put all this ARIA in here and it would be better off without it. And that was an early lesson that I learned, in that if you're not going to do it right, you're better off not doing it at all. But we didn't have, like, that was early Firebug days. We didn't have accessibility tree inspectors and accessibility dev tools. And now we do. And that's amazing, because I've seen very competent developers start to dig in when they're presented with more tools and there's more of a culture around accessibility testing. And so we're trying to bake it into frameworks in ways that we try to have as good of defaults as we can. And that's hard too, but we're working on it. But give people what we call progressive disclosure of complexity, where the default thing works well enough, but you give people the ability to override and customize and do it to their liking, because people are going to use frameworks for whatever their reasons are. So I've definitely tried to put energy into accessibility improvements that impact a lot of people, a lot of developers, a lot of users. That was just something that I thought would be worthwhile, as opposed to one website at a time. So deciding where to put your energy as an accessibility expert is worth thinking about, and just trying to bring people along. I know it's hard because it is frustrating, especially when you see how people with disabilities are affected. Like, we should be mad about that. Like, that is frustrating and sad. But at the same time, like, if we can make it approachable while being real about it, I think that there's a much more encouraging space that we could make, so that people know that they have places to talk to colleagues, and I don't know, and the opportunity to make tools and specs better. So the fact that a lot of these specs are on GitHub is amazing. There's open source tools, like Xcore is open source, so you can go and file a bug, try and improve the space. So I think it's opened up a lot, it's improved a lot, but we still have quite a bit of work to do. So I don't know, there's something in there for each of us to like find our own role in it and try to expand our networks. Like seeing that light bulb go on one person at a time of like, oh, I can make a big impact on my work. And to have Kathleen and Aisha on this call, having said that somehow I had an influence on them. Jared, you had a huge influence on me. I took one of your workshops at the CSUN conference, and that was very pivotal in my career to be in the room and feel like, wow, I'm not alone. These are my people. And to just have that growth moment, like we all have ways that we can impact those around us. And it might feel slow going and kind of depressing at times, but we are making an impact. And yeah, so we just have to keep that positive momentum, even when it feels somewhat depressing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I've had the discussion with developers on like, okay, well, because I did sort of wonder, like with the ARIA stuff, is ARIA the issue? Is the way that we're teaching accessibility the issue? And, one of the responses I got was like, well, it's not unusual for developers to have to deal with weird, unique problems that are happening for some, reason they completely don't understand and have to get help with. And, accessibility isn't different in that way. And, if they just opened up a screen reader after they added the ARIA label, they, it wouldn't have kept being an issue. But I do, I know when I was at DQ, we did spend a lot of time thinking about like, you know, a lot of accessibility training and the way we orient things tends to be geared towards like people who want to be accessibility experts, which is not most developers. You know, they want to be able to do it as part of their work, but they don't want to spend their career on it. I mean, do you think that there is a difference between teaching, you know, people who want to be experts versus developers, and how do you account for that in training? Kathleen, you seem to be nodding a lot.
I'm nodding because I'm smiling because for all the times I've been baking in accessibility into these components, I have one teammate and a squad mate from a different squad that have been doing just some awesome accessibility work just from like digging into components and just learning more about accessibility, learning more how to solve problems. It's been awesome to like not have someone go, hey, how do I do this? It just said, hey, I've seen some really powerful patterns that have correct usage of ARIA and it's not like sprinkled all over the place. And it's just amazing to see like it's spreading in a way that this person said that here's a pattern here, here's an O'Hara pattern, look at this, do this. So, you know, like we just did this something for like a tab group and something for pagination and for all these other things, like look at this. And we're just curating articles for people to read that breaks down the success criteria into manageable chunks to reduce the level of overwhelm. And it's just exciting to see people just start grasping and to start just tackling it on their own without just giving up. So I'm encouraged. So that's why I'm nodding.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, and to your question, I think there is currently a bit of a distinction in how we approach accessibility training in education, that it's in right now somewhat focused on that accessibility expert. I use the analogy quite often, and I think we can learn from the history of physical accessibility and, you know, the ADA. You know, we have these phases of inaccessible, and then we had architects that would design buildings and then go to their ADA expert to add the wheelchair ramps and widen the doors, and then within architectural firms they started to have their specialists, because they thought, well, that's a lot of work, that isn't very effective to go, you know, pay that outside expert. So they became experts within those, you know, architectural firms. And now if you go to school to become an architect, you learn accessibility because it's your job, you know, and we're somewhere kind of in phase 2 or 3 of that, where we have, you know, these ADA specialists, and, you know, I and some of us are those people, and we're getting more of those internal. But I'm optimistic that we're starting to turn that corner to where our web architects are starting to learn about accessibility. And certainly awareness is higher, but we need to get that technical expertise. And I think we're getting there. I'm optimistic about the future, but I think a lot of it's helping them understand that it's their job to build accessibility.
Totally. Well, and you know, the role of like UI engineer seems to be growing a lot, and you know, this organizations want to build their own pattern libraries, which from an accessibility standpoint, that should be a huge opportunity. So yeah, hopefully they'll be thinking about it as they develop those.
Yeah, even in, sorry, Caitlin, go ahead.
No, go. Good.
So one of my other jobs is that I teach at a coding boot camp, and it's actually been really encouraging in the last several years to go from campaigning basically for accessibility to be baked into the curriculum to, I came back after a couple of years to teach part-time, and I was so pleased to see that it was absolutely like part of the process from the beginning. They like brought in an outside speaker to do a workshop with the students. I've found points throughout the entire class so far where we can reinforce those ideas. And it's a small example, but I I've seen that shift in just a couple of years, and I hope that it continues and scales.
That's awesome. All right, well, we've got 4 minutes left. Unless anybody has something they really want to jump in with right now, I have an idea for wrapping things up. So anybody?
I was just going to add that I hope that we can accommodate both areas. Like, yes, the experts need camaraderie, and you need to like vent with your colleagues about things that are genuinely hard, but we also need that approachability factor and that beginner space. Like, I see parallels in, JavaScript framework docs. Like, that's what I work on. So it's like we need both pathways. Like, we need those general tools and resources for people who are just learning, who might not ever be an expert, but they still need to do it as part of their job. It's like we need to accommodate both of those things and know that not everybody is going to be an expert, and that's okay. We still need to set them up for success, and encourage it to be part of a culture, because I feel like that's a big key to us really moving the needle, is like having everybody be responsible for it at some level.
Yeah, well, and I think, also providing help in ways that, I don't know, developers expect to be helped, like having the web accessibility Slack, I feel like, is a huge asset and has helped a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't really know how to get help. And, because developers, they want to go to Stack Overflow or, different forums and get accessibility help that way. And yeah, if there are more places for them to do that, then, I feel like that would be a huge improvement. All right, well, to wrap things up, I think we'll go around and say like what you, in your experience, is the most effective way to bring developers around to feeling invested and motivated to do accessibility. All right, we'll start with Marcy.
Well, my doorbell just rang, so my dog is barking his head off in the other room. I guess I would say, like, if you're learning something about accessibility, no matter what your skill level and experience, write about it. Share it with the world, and especially if you're new to it, because that experience, it's great to look back on, but it can be helpful to those in your network looking to, well, what have they learned, and how can I either, learn from that too, or help out. So I think that can really help you develop a practice and communicate to others about what you're learning, and be super helpful to those around you. If anyone is interested in the web accessibility Slack that Caitlin mentioned, I'm an admin for that. You could DM me on Twitter. I have open DMs against my own best judgment, but I am a holder of the keys to that Slack, so I can help you get into that network, because it has been a really great resource for people.
Aisha, how about you?
I would say to find a handful of specific people and just listen. It has been really helpful for me, even having some experience and being familiar with guidelines and making it a practice to make the things that I build accessible. It's been really useful for me to be able to just kind of take in the experience of people who are using the internet all the time with disabilities that I am never going to fully understand. I can't empathize. So it's really important for me to just listen.
All right, Scott, how about you?
I think one of the best ways I've found to get through to developers, designers, whomever, is to, and try to figure out who it is you're talking to and how to best interact with them. I have a very monotone, dry style to the way that I express information, and that doesn't always work out so well. So sometimes I will even point to resources that people in this panel have written about and be like, okay, if what I'm saying doesn't click, like, go read this thing, go look at this report, like maybe those will help you. Or, you work with some people with disabilities, like go talk to them, have them test what you work on, don't just take my word for it. Like, again, like I'm just one guy. Don't trust me, trust the facts. And that will then kind of hopefully help move people along to, do things right. And, if they can be told in a way that resonates with them, then it'll stick better.
Cool. All right, Jared, it's your turn.
Yeah, I'll probably start where I began and echo the thoughts of the other panelists, that it's about understanding the user experience. In all of humanity, the impact of what we have today with the web, it's in many ways for people with disabilities, the great equalizer. So I think it's helping everyone understand that what they do, even if it may seem small, is important, it's impactful, and it matters.
Awesome. And Kathleen, last but not least.
Okay, so I'm gonna echo especially what Aisha said, is like listen, like follow people with disabilities, listen, really, really listen and learn from there. If you're a good writer, write about it, share those articles. And for those that like a one-on-one type of thing, pair with someone, like share your experience of like, this is how I know how to use a tool, and just show, like share what you've learned, talk through it together. And sometimes that learning style will resonate with someone. So sometimes that more one-on-one approach will help someone become more of an advocate themselves.
Absolutely. Cool. Yeah, and I would say also like learn more about AT, because there are so many different configurations. And yeah, and I think, I don't know, for me at least, understanding how the information is going from the person into, your website is super helpful. All right, so that's a wrap on this. Thank you all so much for joining. It's been great having you. This is a great discussion, and I hope you got as much out of it as I did. Quick shout out to Gatsby. I know we had some technical difficulties with our captions, but they did cover live captioning for us. And of course, once this is a recorded thing living on YouTube, it'll be more fully captioned. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.